The fourth commandment wins the originality award. It's the longest of the 10, it has a different version in Deuteronomy 5, and it teams up with the fifth commandment in voicing a call for positive action, rather than another of those thou shalt nots. The fourth commandment says, remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. Or in other words, observe and celebrate the Sabbath day, in order to set it apart as sacred. I love what Bernard Eller has to say about this commandment. He writes, one day a week was set aside for religious observances in honor of God, and this was understood as being a festival, nothing more nor less than a fun day. We want a fun day, all right, but we think that the way to have fun is by forgetting God, rather than remembering God. This is because we haven't gotten to know God well enough to discover that God is fun to be with. What an awesome insight! The Sabbath is an invitation to the festival of God. It's about discovering that God is fun to be with. The reason given in Exodus 20 for celebrating the Sabbath is that God rested on the seventh day after creating the cosmos and giving it the divine thumbs up. Good news! The most important test you'll ever have to take, you've actually already passed with flying colors. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Congrats, you're an A+ on God's report card. Like I saw on a greeting card, when you were created, God said yes. So the Sabbath is a celebration of this awesome completeness of God's creation. It lifts the burden of heavy workloads and deadlines off our shoulders by reminding us that we're not the creators. We are the image of the Creator who rests in the completeness of creation. As my dad always says, there's nothing more stress-free than a reflection. Or as one of my professors puts it, God is not a workaholic, so we don't have to be either. The Sabbath encourages us to approach life as a gift instead of an achievement. It reminds us that the world is safely in God's hands, and it's not going to collapse if we set aside Sabbath moments to pray and worship God. The Hebrews learned this lesson in the wilderness, when God provided them with enough manna and quail on the sixth day so that they didn't have to go out and collect any on the Sabbath. When I asked a Sunday school class of third graders what God gave the children of Israel to eat in the wilderness, one of the students eagerly replied, manna and quesadillas. The Sabbath story of manna promises that when we trust God, rest and worship is possible, because God gives us what we need. Sabbath is the Hebrew people's daring discovery that now that they're ruled by God instead of Pharaoh, non-stop work isn't necessary. In fact, the Deuteronomy 5 version of this commandment gives a whole different reason for observing the Sabbath. Instead of connecting the Sabbath with the completion of creation, like Exodus does, Deuteronomy connects the Sabbath with the Exodus by saying, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So Deuteronomy basically defines Sabbath as a day of thanksgiving for the deliverance from Egypt. Sabbath could be seen as our spiritual declaration of independence from whatever enslaves us. And just as the Exodus version of this commandment encourages us to image God by resting like God rested, the Deuteronomy version of this commandment encourages the head of the house to image God by freeing everyone in the house, including servants and animals, from working on the Sabbath, just like God freed the Hebrew slaves. So this commandment is actually a remarkable humanitarian law. It shows that humans were not created to be slaves to work, and that we are all actually equals in the eyes of God. Also, it reminds us that true independence comes from recognizing our dependence on God. Jesus' actions on the Sabbath day kept on getting him into trouble, but they actually capture the spirit of the Deuteronomy version of the commandment, since his healings freed people from the slavery of sin, sickness, and death. And they capture the spirit of the Exodus version of this commandment, since his healings revealed the completeness of God's creation. When Jesus healed the man at the pool of Bethesda, he got into trouble with the religious authorities because he did such an effective job healing that this man was carrying his bed around, weightlifting, on the Sabbath, which was against the rules that had been written saying what people could or couldn't do on the Sabbath. But Jesus responded that the Sabbath isn't about what humans can't do. It's about what God does, and therefore what God's children can and should do. As Mary Baker Eddy declares in Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, God rests in action. Jesus' actions encourage us to see the Sabbath not as a 24-hour block of time when all activity is banned, but instead as an opportunity, moment by moment, to rely on and worship God, rest and rejoice in the completeness of creation, and act in ways that bring healing and freedom. The renowned Jewish scholar Abraham Heschel describes the Sabbath as not a date, but an atmosphere, in which the appearance of all things has somehow changed. So the Sabbath can be seen as a state of consciousness, and when our thoughts are focused on God, each of our moments can be Sabbath moments, free from stress and filled with balance, rest, healing, and joy. The Bible resources that I quoted in this podcast are listed on the Sunday School section of the tmcyouth.com website.
This podcast is produced and copyrighted by the First Church of Christ Scientists in Boston.